Hello, good listeners. Welcome to Tales from the Mennonite Heritage Archives, a show about people, places, and events from Mennonite history. I'm your host, Dan Dick. November 8th is the 106th anniversary of the Eichenfeld massacre that took place in 1919 as war raged on in the contested region of Russia in what today is Ukraine. On that tragic day, 84 Mennonites were killed by followers of the anarchist revolutionary Nestor Makhno. More killings took place in other Mennonite settlements. Historian Sean Patterson is a PhD candidate at the University of Alberta. He's been studying the identity and ideology of Nestor Makhno and the Makhnovist movement during the Ukrainian Revolution that began around 1917. Sean is the author of the book Makhno and Memory, Anarchist and Mennonite Narratives of Ukraine's Civil War, published by the University of Manitoba Press. This is part one of a three-part conversation recorded in August of 2025. Welcome to Tales, Sean.
Thank you for having me.
The central character in the book you've written is Nestor Makhno, the Ukrainian who led a large force in a struggle for Ukrainian independence. That conflict got mixed into the Russian Civil War and Revolution. What motivated you to study him so deeply?
I first came across Makhno's name and his there as an undergrad. I was looking at some of the left-wing movements that opposed the Bolsheviks at the time, because there hasn't been as much research into that particular topic, at least at the time there wasn't. And it was only later that I found out about the Mennonite connection and how it actually had affected some of the families that I had grown up with. What I found most interesting as a historian was how radically divided the memory was between Mennonites on one side and some Ukrainians on the other side, as well as how Makhno has been represented within left-wing literature globally.
Give us a brief, plain language definition of the kind of anarchy Makhno was pursuing.
Makhno himself was highly influenced by a Russian anarchist named Peter Kropotkin. He was a high-ranking Russian noble, and he was a scientist. He left his rank as a noble to become an anarchist. But prior to that, he had studied in Siberia, and he was studying animals as well as interacting with the indigenous populations. And there he developed his theory of mutual aid. And he thought that mutual aid was more important than competition in surviving. And he came to the conclusion that the state and capitalism disrupted humans' instinct for cooperation. He believed that it encouraged exploitation and competition. And so then to destroy the state and capitalism was necessary, and he felt it would be better to replace that with a kind of federation of autonomous communities in which power would be dispersed and decentralized to the local level. And it's actually interesting to point out that Kropotkin visited Mennonite communities in Canada in the late 1800s, and he spoke positively about them. He felt that the way that Mennonites were socially organized in their communities actually had resonated with some of the ideas that he was working with. The Makhnovists and how this relates to them, it's interesting that the Makhnovists themselves said that they weren't fully anarchist. They felt that you couldn't be anarchist in the midst of a civil war, as well as the peasants weren't, their consciousness, right, wasn't at a level they felt that could fully facilitate full-blown anarchism. So it was something that they felt that they could work towards. But in the context of the Civil War and the Revolution, they saw their army as kind of a clearing force that would destroy the structures of the state and capitalism. They would clear this out, and then that would allow the propagandists, the activists to come in to the communities and help these communities move towards a more anarchistic direction in their social organization. The Makhnovists themselves did this through two means mainly. One was radical direct democracy at the village and regional level. They would hold these regional congresses that brought together delegates from all over the areas that they controlled. And the second, and important for peasants, was the seizure and equitable redistribution of land. And they did this either through the traditional peasant commune, which gave land according to family size and need, or they also established anarchist communes, which were often set up on estates that were seized. Some of these were Mennonite estates that they seized, and then they would have a group of peasants, say, even up to 200 or 300 of them, that would be living and working on these estates collectively.
Now, I think a popular idea of anarchism is more like chaos, and it doesn't sound like mutual aid to a lot of people who might understand that term today.
Yeah, that's how it's been known widely, but I think there has to be a distinction made between the popular conception of what anarchism is, the political philosophy that developed out of people like Kropotkin. There is a slogan that they often use that says anarchy is order. It's the notion that true order comes out of more of observing nature, how nature operates without a kind of organizing state to force it to do things. It's more of an organic conception of social life.
What have you learned about Makhno as a person, as an individual? Was he educated?
So he had very little education. He did have some grade school, but largely he was self-taught. But he showed a very deep interest in ideas. From a young age, he was involved in reading circles, and he was actually involved in a theater troupe as well. So he had an orientation actually towards kind of the humanities and the arts. Then later, he was in prison, and in prison, he continued his sort of self-education. He was also surrounded by other political prisoners who were intellectuals, so he interacted with them at that time. And the prison records that survive actually do show that he was borrowing books, like books on geometry. He had a multilingual dictionary that he requested from the prison authorities. And as well, his wife was, I would characterize her as an intellectual as well. She was a university-educated Ukrainian language teacher who was also interested in women's liberation. So while Makhno himself, he was no intellectual, but throughout his life, he was surrounded by intellectuals and interested in ideas. Another route to his personal ideology that he talks about is abuse that he experienced as a child laborer. So in his memoirs, he talks about being lashed across the face by a supervisor, and that this occurred on a Mennonite farm, according to him. And then on another farm, he talked about the landlord's sons brutally beating a worker. And he says that these events in particular generated a severe hatred for the ruling classes.
You mentioned he was in prison. What was he in prison for?
He belonged to a pre-revolutionary anarchist group in his hometown, Hulepula. They could be characterized as a kind of terrorist group. They would conduct robberies. They burnt down farms and estates of wealthier peasants, as well as Mennonite estates in the area. They ended up assassinating the local police chief. And in the midst of what was going on there, Makhno was caught while he was attempting to blow up the local police station. And he was initially sentenced to death, although he was under the age of execution. So he managed to escape execution and was sentenced to a lifetime of hard labor. However, once the revolution happened, there was an amnesty for political prisoners, and he was categorized as a political prisoner. So that's how he got out.
What was his temperament like?
He's interesting. He's complex and contradictory in many ways. If you read his writings, he was obviously capable of thoughtful reflection, but he could also be highly erratic. He could be simplistically rigid sometimes in his thought as well. And he was emotionally sensitive. Even in his memoirs, this often comes up where he's kind of overwhelmed by the situations. He talks about committing suicide at various points. So there's a certain volatility in him and sensitivity. He also, let's say, he had a kind of, he tried to live by this, his own revolutionary code of conduct, you could say, which focused on social justice and autonomy for his people. But at the same time, he violated that code, right? He created these kind of rules of what was permissible and impermissible behavior and types of violence, but he himself would sometimes get drunk. He himself sometimes would violate, what was kind of the grounds for committing certain types of violence. He believed in equality, but he also showed an authoritarian streak at various times. But I think it's this contradictory nature that really pushes me to keep studying this character and his movement.
There is always a context that gives space and fuel for a person with views like Makhno to rise up for their cause. How did he rise to power and gain so much regional influence?
In the context of the revolution, a lot of the political prisoners who had spent time in jail and had a history of activism prior to the revolution had a certain amount of street cred amongst the population. And so when Makhno returned to his hometown, they talk about him as, rising from the dead. And it's almost messianic in the way it's described sometimes. And he did prove himself a quite capable leader, even politician, although he probably would not like that term as a politician. But he outmaneuvered his rivals in the sort of very early days of the revolution to seize control of at least of his town at that point. But his real rise to prominence didn't happen until the latter half of 1918. And so World War I was going on at this time. And later in 1918, the German army in World War I, they occupied all of Ukraine. And during this occupation, it sparked an all-Ukrainian uprising. So this was happening not just in Makhno's region, but everywhere. There were sort of these peasant groups that emerged and started attacking the German occupiers. Makhno emerged as a leader of the insurgency in his region, and he gathered around himself a large number of supporters. He was very popular with Ukrainian peasants. From all of the accounts, it shows that he was able to connect with them kind of where they were. And he came from the peasantry himself, so he was able to kind of rhetorically connect with them as well. And so he gathered them to fight off the Germans in his area. And then after the Germans, there was the White Army, which was sort of this hodgepodge of more right-wing anti-Bolshevik forces. And he fought the White Army. And then he fought the Bolsheviks as well. So sort of fighting off every force that came into his region. And of course, also the promise to seize lands and distribute them was also very important for gathering support around him. And it's in this context that they first begin fighting with Mennonites, who the German army helped the Mennonites form self-defense units. They armed them and trained them, and it's in that context that they fight with the Makhnovists.
That was historian Sean Patterson, concluding part 1 of our 3-part series on anarchist Nestor Makhno and Mennonites. Join us next week for part 2, when we talk about the Eichenfeld massacre, in which Makhnovists killed 84 Mennonites, plus more in surrounding villages. The Mennonite Heritage Archives holds extensive collections related to Nestor Makhno, the Eichenfeld massacre, and Sean Patterson's book, Makhno and Memory. To see photos related to this story, or to listen to this series again, visit mharchives.ca. The Tales team welcomes your comments and questions about this program via email at info@mharchives.ca.
Hello, I'm Archivist Conrad Stace. The Mennonite Heritage Archives is a community-supported memory center that relies on donations from community members like you. To support this program and the preservation of Mennonite history, visit mharchives.ca and click on Support, or give us a call at 204-560-1998. Thanks also to our partners, Canadian Mennonite University, the Centre for Transnational Mennonite Studies, Mennonite Church Canada, and Golden West Radio.
Thanks to the Tales team of Conrad Stace and David Klippenstein. Tales from the Mennonite Heritage Archives will be back next week. Thanks for listening.